This video contains historical content intended for education, awareness, and reflection. It covers sensitive topics including colonization, racism, and injustice. All stories are told with respect, never to promote hate, but to remember, understand, and learn. Viewer discretion is advised. They called him the missing link. But he was never lost. They put him in a cage. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was different. He came from a forest where the wind had a voice, where the trees were storytellers. And freedom wasn't written in books. It was breathed. But the world wasn't ready for his kind of freedom. It wanted to study him, to own him, to break him, quietly. This is not just a story of a man taken. It's the echo of a world that looked into a mirror and refused to see a human face. Before the world knew his name, before the flash of foreign cameras and the bars that would one day hold his dignity captive, there was only the forest. A vast, breathing cathedral of green where the trees stood like wise old men and the rivers sang lullabies to the wind. This was not just land. This was life. This was home. In the heart of the Congo Basin, where sunlight filtered down like golden dust, lived the Mbuti, a people so deeply tied to the forest, it was said the trees themselves mourned when they died. They were not kings or warriors or merchants. They were not measured by wealth or weapons. They were the children of the forest, small in stature, but giants in harmony. Here, no clocks ticked. No masters barked. Time was told by the rhythm of rainfall, and wisdom flowed not from books, but from the breath of elders gathered by firelight. The Mbuti hunted with bows carved from memory and arrows kissed with poison, not for sport, but for survival. They moved like whispers between trees, barefoot, brown-skinned, bone-lean, their laughter blending with birdsong and their chants rising with the dawn. Ota Benga was born into this world a son of peace, a child of rhythm. His name meant friend, and that was who he was, a friend to the forest, a brother to his people, and a boy whose soul danced with the wind. His early years were marked not by pain, but by purpose. He learned to track the forest's breath, to know when the trees were restless or when the rain would fall before it whispered its arrival. He watched the elders speak to spirits beneath ancient trees. He saw the sacred smoke rise from fire pits and listened as the drumbeats told stories of creation, of ancestors, of harmony. His mother would hum songs while weaving leaves into baskets. His father taught him how to crouch low in the brush, how to listen with his skin, how to respect the antelope before taking its life. The Mbuti did not build cities. They built connection. Their homes were small domes of woven branches and broad leaves, light enough to carry when the forest beckoned them elsewhere. There were no locks. No prisons. No gods that demanded gold or blood. Only the sacred hush of nature, and a belief that the forest was not theirs to own, they were hers to belong to. At night, under the moon's calm eye, Ota Benga would lie beside the embers of a dying fire, listening to stories carved in voice alone. Myths of trickster spirits. Of animal brothers. Of the first Mbuti man who climbed the tallest tree to speak with the sky. The forest was not a place to him, it was a mother, a guardian, a language. And in that sacred rhythm, he found joy. He did not know what money was. He had never heard the word evolution. He had not seen a wall, or a gun, or the sea. His world stretched as far as the forest's edge, and that was enough. For here, he was not an exhibit. He was not a curiosity. He was not less. He was whole. But even in the calmest of forests, a storm can gather far beyond the treetops. And somewhere beyond that green horizon, it had already begun to thunder. But beyond the trees, the world had begun to darken. It came not with roars, but with rumblings, first in the distance, then underfoot. A tide of boots and iron moved through the Congo like fire through dry grass. The forest, once a cradle of life, was now caught in the grip of men who came not to live with nature, but to carve it open. Under the name of King Leopold II of Belgium, the Congo had been claimed as a private kingdom not for its people, but for its resources. And in this twisted empire, wealth did not drip from trade or peace. It poured in from blood and rubber. To enforce this unholy rule, Leopold raised a force unlike any other, the force publique. A brutal army of African mercenaries led by white officers, trained not to protect, but to punish. Their orders were clear: harvest rubber. Quotas must be met. Villages must obey. Resistance would be burned, beaten, or buried. The forest wept. Where once Ota Benga's people hunted in silence, now came the crack of rifles and the screams of the chased. Where songs once rose over cooking fires, now there was only smoke, blood, and the rustle of soldiers moving like vultures through the underbrush. Ota Benga's village, his haven, his home, did not escape. They did not run. They had no walls to hide behind, no battalions to call upon. They were met not as humans, but as obstacles. And in one violent sweep, the peace of his world was shattered. His wife was unalived. His children, taken or unalived. His people scattered like leaves before a hurricane. The forest that once sang now stood in stunned silence. Ota was taken not as a warrior captured in battle, but as a man robbed of everything. Bound, broken, and silent, he was dragged into a world he did not recognize. His body remained, but something inside had been carved out, the kind of wound no medicine could heal, the kind that settles deep into the soul like a stone in water. He was not the only one. Throughout the Congo, thousands faced the same fate. Hands were severed as warnings. Children were used as leverage. Entire communities vanished like smoke. And all the while, rubber flowed into Europe, feeding factories, lighting lamps, making kings wealthier than gods. To the colonizers, the Mbuti were primitive. But to Ota, it was their machines, their whips, their hunger for land and gold that felt foreign. Alien. Savage. Now alone, stripped of name, family, and forest, Ota Benga found himself in the hands of men who did not see him as a brother or a son, but as an object. A curiosity. A transaction to be traded across oceans. He had not yet seen the sea. He had never dreamed of America. But a different kind of storm had already begun, not with bullets this time, but with bargains and lies. And from the heart of the Congo to the heart of a foreign empire, Ota's journey was about to begin. Not as a traveler, but as a display. They didn't ask his name. They didn't ask if he wanted to leave, if he was grieving, if he was ready. They simply exchanged hands, not as one human to another, but as buyer to seller. And just like that, Ota Benga became property once again. The man who claimed him was Samuel Phillips Werner, an American missionary turned explorer. He spoke with smooth conviction, wore the air of a savior, and came under the banner of science and anthropology. But behind the noble language lay the same foundation: to take, to collect, to exhibit. Werner had been sent to find specimens for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, a global spectacle meant to celebrate progress, invention, and empire. And what better way, they thought, to show the greatness of civilization than by parading those they considered uncivilized. And so, Ota Benga, still mourning, still silent, was taken from the ashes of his forest and led toward a sea he had never seen. The ocean stretched like a wound that wouldn't close. The ship that carried him across it was not a vessel of freedom, but of transition, a cold, creaking beast that tore him farther and farther from the soil that had once held his roots. He arrived in America not as a refugee, not as a guest, but as an exhibit. In the hot, bustling chaos of St. Louis, people came from all over the world to see machines, inventions, and cultures on display. But for Ota and others like him, their culture wasn't represented through artifacts or art, it was their bodies, their breath, their presence, that was put behind ropes and on stages. They were labeled primitive, tribal, exotic. Signs explained their height, their customs, their homes, but not their pain. Crowds pointed, gawked, laughed. Children mimicked his movements. Adults snapped photographs, documenting him like a butterfly pinned beneath glass. They called it science. But it felt more like a circus. Ota stood beside others taken from colonized lands, from the Philippines, from Africa, from the islands. They were placed in huts constructed by foreigners, made to perform dances they didn't know, to reenact savage rituals, to carry spears not in pride, but in costume. The cultural clash was deafening. Where he once walked barefoot in sacred forests, now he stood under foreign skies and flashing cameras. He could not speak their language. They could not feel his silence. Their curiosity was not the kind that sought to understand, but to observe, to compare, to judge. Still, Ota Benga did not snarl. He did not break. He watched. He listened. And somewhere beneath the performance they forced upon him, his soul held tight to the memory of trees, and a name he would not forget. The fair ended. The crowds faded. But for Ota, the show was not over. He was no longer a boy from the forest. To them, he was now a trophy of science, a curiosity of flesh and bone. And the next destination would make that even clearer. The fair had ended, but the illusion did not fade. Ota Benga, now adrift in a foreign land, was passed again not into a home, not into healing, but into another chapter of spectacle. America did not know what to do with a man it had stripped of context. To them, he was still not a person. He was a puzzle piece forced into a false story of human evolution, a living body cast into a theory's mold. And so, 2 years later, he was placed at the Bronx Zoo in New York City not as a visitor, but as an exhibit. In the shadow of concrete enclosures and iron gates, Ota Benga was caged in the monkey house, a brick building meant to display apes, monkeys, and now, a man. He was made to share space with an orangutan named Dohong, as though their proximity proved something. As if the sharp lines of civilization could be drawn by skin and teeth alone. As if science could be built on shame. Visitors crowded around. They read signs describing him as part of evolution's missing link. Newspapers called him the pygmy. They noted his sharp-filed teeth, a sacred symbol of manhood in his culture, and twisted them into symbols of wildness. They laughed. They pointed. Some mocked. Others stared in silence. He was not an animal. But they placed him among them. His silence became part of the show. His sorrow became invisible, tucked beneath layers of white imagination. The zoo authorities claimed he was happy. They said he volunteered. They said he laughed. But the eyes of the few who truly looked, they told a different story. A story of a man suffocating in sight. Still, not everyone accepted the cruelty cloaked in science. From pulpits across Harlem and Brooklyn, black ministers raised their voices. Reverend James H. Gordon, among others, condemned the zoo's actions as a stain on morality, a barbarous display that reduced human life to spectacle. They marched. They wrote. They called out the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed progress, yet imprisoned a man for curiosity's sake. They reminded America that dignity is not a matter of skin or size or origin, it is sacred, universal, and non-negotiable. But even as protests grew, the zoo resisted. Letters poured in. Editorials debated. The story made national headlines, splitting a country between those who defended the scientific interest and those who saw the horror for what it truly was, a cage not made of bars, but of ignorance, arrogance, and exploitation. Eventually, under mounting pressure and public unrest, Ota Benga was removed from the cage. But freedom is not always the absence of walls. He had been seen, but not understood. He had been moved, but not healed. And though the door had opened, the wound had only deepened. They took him from the cage, but they could not unmake what the world had already carved into him. With public pressure mounting and protests refusing to fade, Ota Benga was quietly removed from the Bronx Zoo, not into the arms of family, not into the forest he had once known, but into yet another chapter of loneliness painted as kindness. He was placed in a Negro orphanage in Lynchburg, Virginia, a home for black children without parents, though he was no child, and his parents were not gone by chance. They had been taken by fire and bullet and history's cruelty. Yet here, in a foreign land that had never once asked him where he wanted to be, he was expected to start over. The caretakers meant well. They gave him clothes stiff, pressed suits that clung to his shoulders like borrowed names. They taught him English, and he learned quickly, as though the forest within him still remembered how to adapt to the winds of survival. He walked the streets. He greeted people in the tongue of the land. He sat through sermons. He smiled at children. And yet, no matter how he bent himself to fit their shape, he remained a ghost wrapped in cloth not his own. Where others saw a man learning a new life, Ota felt something deeper, a quiet dismembering of soul. Every word he spoke in English was a word further from his mother's tongue. Every suit he wore was a thread torn from the skin of his past. The world around him praised progress, but inside, he mourned like a forest whose roots had been pulled from beneath the soil. They called him civilized. But he felt severed. He would sit in the evenings alone, carving small tools from wood, mimicking the forest rituals he once knew. But the wind no longer carried the scent of home. The stars above Virginia were colder, more distant. And in the hush of night, he would whisper words no one understood, calling out not for help, but for memory. He longed to return. He begged to go home. But Africa was now a dream behind locked borders. He wrote letters, made requests. Werner, the man who had brought him across the sea, had promised him a return, but that promise now lay buried under the weight of silence and distance. The world that had taken everything from him now offered him nothing but waiting. And so, Ota Benga remained trapped, not by steel this time, but by the soft, suffocating blanket of forgetting. They taught him to speak. But they never listened. They clothed his body. But they never saw his wound. And the forest inside him, once vast, once sacred, had begun to fall silent, leaf by leaf. The forest never came back. Not in the quiet fields of Virginia. Not in the echo of sermons. Not in the tidy rows of American streets, where the trees stood stiff and tamed. No drum ever called to him again. No fire ever sang the stories of his ancestors. His laughter, once wild as a bird, had become a brittle thing, caged behind his teeth. And though he walked with others, Ota Benga was more alone than he had ever been in the deepest parts of the Congo. The world around him moved forward. Seasons changed. Roads were paved. But inside him, time had stopped on the day the sky above his village turned red. He smiled for others, but in his heart there were no more songs, only echoes. He was a man breathing among ghosts. Every attempt to begin again felt like betrayal. Every lesson in English erased a memory in Benga. Every Sunday suit he wore was a funeral robe for the forest that had once been his cathedral. The children at the orphanage grew. They found dreams in this new world. But Ota carried no dreams. Only ashes. He tried to work. He tried to plant roots in a soil that did not know his name. But the roots would not take. How could they? The tree had already been felled. And slowly, silently, the sadness began to eat away at him, not loudly, not with rage, but with the quiet erosion that comes when a man forgets the sound of his own soul. By March 20th, 1916, Ota Benga had waited long enough. He had waited for home. He had waited for someone to truly see him, not as a pygmy, not as a symbol, not as a display, but as Ota, son of the forest, husband, father, friend. And when that seeing never came, he chose silence. He took a gun he had hidden. And he pulled the trigger. The bullet did not just end a life. It ended a prayer the world had never answered. There were no parades. No monuments. No apologies. Just a line in a local paper, and a whisper that faded quickly from memory. But to those who truly listened, who dared to look past the headlines and the history books, Ota Benga's death was more than a tragedy. It was a scream without sound. A cry carved into history's bones. A final act of a man who had been taken from his people, stripped of his world, and buried in plain sight. And though the forest never came back to him, he has now returned to the forest of our memory. The world forgot him. For a time. Buried in silence, Ota Benga's story slipped through the cracks of textbooks and headlines. His name became a footnote, a fading photograph, a question mark in museum archives. But history does not sleep forever. And some names refuse to stay caged. His life is now taught in classrooms that once ignored him. His face is now etched in museums that once caged his memory. And in the quiet hearts of those who have read his story, he has become more than a man. He has become a question. A question that asks, what happens when we fail to see the full humanity in others? And more importantly, what might still happen if we choose to see it now? He was born among trees that bent with the wind, not with fear. He was raised by a people who did not build empires, but built peace. He was taken, displayed, and discarded, but his spirit remained unbroken. They tried to cage his body, but they could not cage his name. They tried to silence his voice, but history now speaks it louder. Ota Benga was never the savage. He was never the missing link. He was Ota. He was Benga. He was friend. He was man. And now, he is remembered. Don't forget to subscribe to Forgotten Africa for more powerful stories and real forgotten African history.